Kylea Taylor, welcome to Psychedelic IQ. Out of all of the episodes that we are recording for season one, this is the one that I am the most excited about. So thank you so much for being here.
That's really nice of you to say. I'm really glad to be with you too, GB.
Um, I will tell you, and just anybody listening to this, and as I shared just before we started recording, I had been in my work for almost 15 years, and I have studied with a number of teachers that are serving medicine in a lot of different ways. But last year, I opened up a spiritual community center, and my life, like a spiritual community center that had nothing to do with medicine work, and my life got so confusing because all of these people that had been sort of friends, or maybe I had mentored them, now some of them became like I became their landlord, I became their spiritual director, I became a friend, I became a mentor, I became their coach, and it all got really confusing really fast. And it wasn't until a mutual friend of ours, Christina Hunter, who was one of my mentors, said, "Hey, maybe you should read this book by Kylea Taylor." And I said, "Oh, thank you. Somebody is actually speaking my language." So if anybody out there has not already read The Ethics of Caring by Kylea, which I think you wrote in 1995, is that right?
I wrote the first book in 1995, and then I rewrote it in 2017 with 22 years more experience and reorganized it. And yeah, 80 more pages. So you're going to
Well,
buy it, buy the second one.
Well, I can tell you that there's more highlights in this book right now than almost any other book. And it is in so many ways has become a Bible for me in the work that I'm doing. So as somebody working with clients and working with groups, if you haven't bought it yet, pick up a copy. So
That's really great that it's been useful to you. It gets so complex when you have all those different selves and relationships, and all the other people have all their selves. And yeah, it
well,
does.
for anybody who hasn't read the book or doesn't know you or your name, let's start with what kind of work you're doing right now, and then what got you to this point. Like, what's your origin story?
What I'm doing right now is InnerEthics, and I trademarked that word because I wanted what we're doing to be done really well and up to a certain standard. So I think that ethical relationship is what is healing. Ethics is about relationship. And what I've really focused on for the last 30 years is how do I teach what is necessary in extraordinary states of consciousness? How do you learn about that? And I've come up with some tools and I teach that. And I've been teaching in a lot of training programs for psychedelic work. It's been really great because, for about 20 years, nobody was really interested in ethics or in my kind of ethics. And in fact, they wanted to run the other way from anything that had to do with ethics. They felt defensive or didn't like it or didn't want to be controlled or whatever. But my work is not about that. It's about learning to know yourself and learning to be a better at person at caring for a person who is very vulnerable in an extraordinary state of consciousness. And finding out about ourselves is really kind of interesting. It's like watching a really good TV series and not knowing what the next episode is going to be and just getting into it.
What do you think? My experience with ethics prior to bumping into your book, my experience was in a business ethics course in college, and it was really heavy. It had very little to do with me. And there always seemed to be, like, I know that there's no specific right and wrong in ethics, but there was always some element of like, you did this wrong, or there's some shaming involved in this. How would you say your opinion or your approach is different?
Well, I think everybody makes mistakes. And I think the main thing that's different about my approach is compassion. I really don't think that you can learn from your mistakes, unless you get to a place of self compassion. So the first step in any kind of self inquiry, ethical self inquiry, is to get to self compassion. And sometimes we need other people to help us do that.
Yeah. So, what do you think is ethically different about setting for people in an extraordinary state of consciousness versus just doing maybe traditional therapy work or coaching?
Well, I think the main thing is that the person that you're sitting for or facilitating the session is usually very vulnerable, extra suggestible, and very sensitive. They, in ordinary states of consciousness, they can also pretty well take care of themselves in terms of protection and have some ego defenses and so forth. And in a psychedelic session or any breath work or any extraordinary state of consciousness session, that may go out the window, and it has to. Vulnerability is a precursor of change. It's a prerequisite of change in itself. You have to get to a place where you don't know anything, or you are in a place that you are willing to go into the unknown. And that is a vulnerable place. And you need somebody there to uh, protect you in this physical sense, because you might not really understand material reality while you're in that state, protect you emotionally, and protect you from them. They need to protect you from them. And that's where self knowing comes in. It's really important to do our own consciousness development so that we can really be there in a good way for people.
Just featured in an article on ecstatic integration, and the article was called Kylea Taylor on the Woman Who Lost Everything. And I think it's a really, really good opportunity to just give an example of what happens when we don't stand in a really firm ethical place. Would you mind just sharing about the woman who lost everything?
Yes, I use this in my teaching, and I use it as an example. I always go back to it as an example for almost everything, because it has so many good points in it. It was the first ethical situation that really got my attention. I was teaching with Stanislav Grof in the Grof transpersonal training, and I noticed that there were just a couple of people, but they were really surprising people, people that I thought were really ethical and they were really good therapists, but they were getting into trouble when they went back into their office and did one-on-one extraordinary state, in this case, holotropic breath work with their clients. And so in this case, this woman was halfway through her training, and she had gotten so much out of it that she wanted to do breath work for this long-term client that she had. And she went back in a one-on-one situation in her office and sat for this person who was doing breath work. And what happened was they had a very deep experience of merging with each other, a oneness experience. And they didn't know what to do with it. They thought, well, this is happening, so I must be needing to have a romantic relationship. That was the only reference for such an experience. for them. And so they did. And a couple of months later, the client began to feel exploited, which the client was, because any romantic or sexual interaction in a sacred responsibility um, is abuse. So the client went to the ethics board and even um, litigated with the therapist in a court of law, and the therapist lost everything, lost the relationship and lost her license and lost all her money and even her house because she had to pay lawyers. And, some people might say, well, yeah, she shouldn't have done it and so forth. But I think that traditional ethics education let this person down because she obviously had some kind of an ethics course because she was licensed, but it didn't kick in. And I think one of the reasons it doesn't kick in is because all those ethical shoulds and shouldn'ts and do's and don'ts get filed in our neocortex, and it takes a while. That's the slowest part of our brain. Our reactions really happen in our lizard brain and our whatever that is in the middle of the brain. I can't think of it right now. That has to do with emotions. And that's what happened. And so I thought something different needs to happen to complement traditional ethics education. So that's what I've been thinking about for the past 3 decades. How do we do that? And what's ethically different is that all those ethical injunctions and codes and laws and standards of care still apply because you still have those issues, but you have more of them, and the ones that you have are more complex and have more power to them. So you need to pay attention to those laws, but you also have different ethical issues. And some of them are expanded. They're expanded cartography of the psyche, as Stan pointed out. He wrote a cartography of the psyche, which included not just biography in therapy, in therapeutic situations, but what comes up. As we know, as practitioners, birth and death issues and transpersonal issues and perinatal issues come up. So it's much broader cartography of experiences, and it's also harder to focus as a practitioner for many hours and have patience and compassion and not get triggered ourselves. So that's the other thing, is that we're very likely to get triggered in some part of our unconscious by somebody else's extraordinary state of consciousness.
There's so much we could go down, so many different paths there.
I know.
I read this article last night on the woman who lost everything, and I shared something with you in an email because it really hit me, and I want to come back to this this notion of oneness. Now, in fairness, I was sitting with a dear friend. This is not in a professional capacity, but when you were the first person actually who gave voice and words to what I experienced with this individual, and there was a moment, more than a moment, a couple of hours in an expanded state of consciousness where the individual and I found ourselves in love. And it was such like we slipped into this space, and it didn't make a whole lot of sense where we were at, but it was just a beautiful, beautiful experience. And then what happened, rather than just being in love, I found myself being in love with this individual. And I thought that this individual was going to be the thing that kept me coming back to love. So I started to displace the feeling of love, and I started using this person as a method to get to that place. And you were the first person, this idea of oneness, of where these people merged together. And thank God for me that it happened when I was with a close and dear friend and not in a professional capacity, because I had no idea or context of what was happening. And it took months for us to unwind what had happened and for us to understand and to rebuild trust, because in some ways, neither one of us thought that we were breaching any ethical boundaries. We thought that we were in it together, but the very nature of these substances, they are designed to break down our boundaries. So I'm curious, what happens when we're dealing with a substance, whether a practice, whether it's breath work or a psychedelic? What are the standards of care? How do the standards of care change when we intentionally drop all of the boundaries?
I think the standard of care is that the person who's sitting really is clearly the responsible party and is responsible for the boundaries. The person who is being vulnerable so that they can go into what is unknown and make changes needs to express and feel anything that they're feeling. So they don't have boundaries. The responsible party holds the boundaries. And I really like that term because it reminds us that that's my job. I'm
A responsible party. Somebody's got to take some ownership.
That's right. So I think, for example, if a client is feeling their sexuality and really getting into that and opening up something in themselves that is becoming more part of their consciousness and their body sensations and so forth, that is great. But perhaps, many people have sexual abuse as a child in their background. I think it's 1 in 4 women and 1 in 13 men, according to the CDC. And you don't know if that client necessarily is one of those people. And so that might come up. And a lot of the people that have felt some kind of sexual abuse as a child, they oh gosh.
All right. Take your time, or we can start over too. It's all right.
No, that one is pretty important. So a lot of those people have tried to please their perpetrator, and they might initiate some kind of sexual advance towards the responsible party. But again, it's the responsible party's role to hold that boundary while encouraging them to continue feeling what they're feeling, that they're doing great. So that's just one example. that. If you could tell me again what you wanted me to address.
Yeah. Well, I think I want to follow that thread because it's a really interesting example. If there's a practitioner who is facilitating and the participant begins having a sexual experience, and maybe that participant is now directing some of that sexual energy back to the facilitator, it would be really easy as a facilitator to say, oh, well, this person is clearly like showing interest in me, so therefore some way it's okay. I'm not making an advance, I'm not doing anything wrong, this person is actually showing interest in me, so therefore I should like engage in this. And what I think I just heard you say is it could absolutely be the acting out of an old childhood or an old trauma wound, that if the facilitator doesn't have really clear boundaries and some agreements up front, this gets really complicated really fast. And sometimes we don't even know how we got there. Did I hear that right?
Absolutely. You heard it right. Yes, and we need to have this kind of situation named among many situations that need to be named and practiced in training, like role plays. How do you address that if an advance is made to you in the middle of a session? How do you turn it back and say, this is, can you take this inside? Can you take this internally? It's really great that you're feeling. So to practice these kinds of difficult interactions and communications that happen in a session or even in integration sessions is really important.
So that was one of my questions. Like, can these skills be taught? What would you say the critical attributes of a good psychedelic assisted psychotherapist are? Like, what are the attributes that people should think about? And then can those skills be taught?
Yeah, I think they're basically two, and Stan has written some, but the basics are having a commitment to self-awareness and ongoing personal work, I think is really, really important. And having a staunch commitment to being that responsible party and keeping the boundaries and keeping the client's best interests, whatever those are, in the forefront. And Stan's list that he wrote in 1985 in Beyond the Brain, he wrote that there is consciousness development in the person, that they're continuing their consciousness development, and they have some awareness of everything: relationship, environment, what's going on inside of them. And self-awareness is the second one. And the third one is having gone through some of the intense experiences of terror and fear, death rebirth experiences, or just reliving birth, things that you don't think you're going to get through, and then you do. To have that experience and trust the inner healing and intelligence is really important, so that you don't get in the way because of your own fear. Because a person who is the experiencer might pick up that fear and think, oh, this is not right. I shouldn't be doing this. I can't get through this. I pick up your own fear. And if you've gone through that and you trust that people can get through what's going on for them, that it wouldn't have come up if they couldn't get through it. And your job, my job, is to produce the right conditions for that process to complete.
What would you say to someone if they came up to you and said, you know what? like I didn't have a difficult childhood. I really don't have trauma. So this is really like a great thing for me to do because I can show up and not have any of these triggers that you're talking about.
I would say they probably haven't yet experienced them.
Yeah. Follow up to that question. Do you think that the standard of ethics that we're talking about today are the same for above ground and below ground facilitators?
Tell me more about what you're thinking about that.
So imagine you are offering ketamine in a clinical setting. And then maybe if we look at Oregon right now, having some of their first psilocybin treatment centers opening, and then we look at somebody who is operating underground and is serving psychedelics either one-on-one or maybe somebody who is a traveling medicine carrier that's bringing a substance to a group of people. Do all of those practitioners have the same standard of ethics?
I don't think they necessarily do. I don't think two people are the same, but I think what how you describe your ethics is different than the principles of ethics. I think the principles are the same for any situation in which we are a responsible party for somebody's extraordinary state of consciousness experience. That we need to know ourselves, that we need to really be compassionate and patient and trust the process and um, put the client's best interest first. All of those things are principles and they apply underground or in a clinical setting. And to focus on the person to make sure that you are there for protection. I've heard stories about ketamine experiences where people just hook them up and leave the room. And to me, that's really unethical.
Hmm.
That
Yeah.
that can produce, I think, an abandonment experience or a lack of a corrective experience if a person goes into that kind of subject matter.
Yeah. You mentioned some traits about good psychedelic assisted psychotherapists. Would you be willing to share any thoughts on maybe more negative traits that maybe a client might look out for if they were seeking out somebody to work with?
Well, I think I'd rather talk about it from the positive is that if I were a client looking for somebody, I would ask them, are they how are you getting feedback? How are you doing your own work? Um, I don't need to know the details about that, but I guess I would like to know that they have feedback and they have supervision or consultation with somebody else because we're blind to some of the things that we do and some of our shadow material, and it's really good to know that they're getting some help for challenges that might occur. And I would be looking to see if they keep their agreements, if they do a thorough job in preparation for the session. I think one of the things that's important to do in preparation is for the practitioner to do everything they think of to prepare well for that particular client session and not uh, disregard something that they think of because I think the universe is trying to tell us, here, pay attention to this in this case. And we brush it off sometimes because it's too much work or, I don't want to read about that because it's an issue for this person or I don't want to. And so thorough preparation about what's going to happen, informed consent, and all of that is really
Mm.
important. And most people who are practitioners know that.
You mentioned something in the article, which is a couple of words that I've never heard put together before. And I'm wondering if you could explain the concept and maybe the outcome or ramifications of a trauma capsule.
I think I got that. I can't remember for sure, but I think I got that in my training for brain spotting, which is a method that came out of EMDR and is an extraordinary state of consciousness when the client is working in that way. And the idea is that there is a spot in the brain that hooks up to a spot in the body where you feel something, and that content can come out in kind of a free flow of associations when you hold the spot with your eyes that matches the spot in your body. It hooks up to the brain in some way. And to me, this goes also with Stan Grof's coex system, which means that traumatic experiences or profound experiences that happen are linked in the same place in our brain somehow in terms of sensation and emotion. So if you have the same sensation of being choked a couple of times in your life, that trauma would be associated in your brain too. Of, oh my gosh, this is the same thing. Um, and he also says that it can be linked biographically or in utero experiences or transpersonal experiences, that same body brain connection. So that's what I mean.
Hmm. Let's say a facilitator, we'll go back to the earlier story. Somebody's having maybe an experience of a sexual nature, and the facilitator recognizes what's happening and can spot some overwhelm or maybe flooding within themselves that says, whew, I'm now activated. Something's happening in me that I was not expecting. Any suggestions on what a facilitator can do? Like we're in the middle of a thing, and what can a facilitator do in that situation that is both safety producing and ethical for the client and for themselves?
I think just like in a Vipassana meditation, you can name it
Hmm.
and you can remember that your job right now is right here and now with this person, and and make a little tiny fast agreement with yourself that this needs tending to, and keep that agreement after the session so that parts of yourself will know and trust that you will do that. Because sometimes the inner healer says, no, I've just been waiting too long, and I'm gonna take over, and just you you I don't trust you because you haven't taken care of it in the past. So I think those things are what I would do, and I think it's inevitable that it happens to us in sessions, and it happens less if we do our own personal work and in extraordinary states of consciousness, both practicing being the experiencer and also practicing sitting. And I think it's really important to practice sitting with a supervisor. So it didn't happen very often with holotropic breath work, but sometimes when there were trainers and facilitators walking the floor, a sitter who was practicing being with an experiencer would get triggered, just like you said, and kind of fall out and need one of the facilitators to sit down and be their sitter. But you don't have that opportunity if you're in a one-on-one situation. I think Group work is really much safer, and with a lot of training for the people that are facilitators.
Mentioned the inner healer a couple of times and maybe even mentioned
Mm-hmm.
the inner healing intelligence. Uh, Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, well, everybody just takes for granted that we have an inner healer physically, that if you get a cut on your finger and you give it the right conditions, like maybe put an antiseptic or a Band-Aid on it, you don't have to think about it anymore. The body just does what it needs to do, sends the right chemicals to the right places, takes away the things that it should take away, and it heals. I think, and my experience has been, that there is an inner healing intelligence that does the same thing with the psyche. And that when there is an opportunity, the inner healer will kind of sit up and take notice and say, ooh, this is the right time for a healing of this experience. And it will bring it forward. And then our job as a responsible party is to provide the right conditions as best we can. And the responsibility of the experiencer is to cooperate with that and trust it too, and just let it happen. Let the expressions come. Let the body move. So that's a short version of the inner healing intelligence that we call the inner healer in holotropic breathwork.
Beautiful. We're gonna move on here in a moment, but I have one last question. What advice would you give to someone who already has felt like they have breached their personal ethics? Maybe they didn't know it in the moment. They come out of a situation and they say, wow, like I really shouldn't have done what I did. And there is now some secret keeping that's already taken root. What would you tell that person right now if they were sitting in front of you in a completely confidential space?
Had they already told me what they did?
Nope. They haven't told you yet. It's still a secret
Uh-huh.
that is sort of like metastasizing inside of them.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that you're not alone. We all make mistakes. There's a taboo in the field, in any professional field, about admitting your mistakes, losing your license, fear of all that, what other people will judge you, and so forth. And I would say, what was the healing impulse in that particular action? So, what was the inner healer trying to do for the client or for you? And sometimes it's for both. And if you can come to that, it's easier to get to self-compassion. And self-compassion is really, again, the prerequisite to learning from your mistakes. I think guilt is what you've agreed to feel if you're not willing to change.
Oof. Hold on. I'm going to take you back. Guilt is what you have agreed to feel if you're not willing to change. So if I can reverse engineer that, the minute that I'm become willing to change, which might accept vulnerability or might vulnerability is required, self-compassion is required, but the minute that I'm willing to change, I think that what I just heard is that's the fastest way out of guilt.
I think so. Um, because if you really know that you wouldn't do it again, you can forgive yourself.
Hmm. It sounds so easy with us just sitting here talking about it. And there are a couple of times, just even in my like straight coaching practice, when I have made decisions, when I have said something to someone where I have held on to this guilt for a long time. Fortunately, I have a great support system. I have mentors and other coaches that I can go to, and even sharing it with them decreases that amount of shame. But
Mm-hmm.
making that, saying to myself, yep, what I did there, not right. I'm Rather than choosing to feel guilt or shame about it, I'm going to make a choice now not to do that again. And that immediately opens up a space for self-compassion.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of things you can do after that self-compassion. You can do repair, for example, and not from a place of shame or guilt, but from a place of understanding the wound that you created and wanting to do whatever that person needs to help repair. So, and also you can go into, well, how did I get there? You can do more personal work. How did I get there? What were the triggers? Where are my vulnerabilities to unethical behavior in that kind of situation? And you can do all this, by the way, as a therapist or as a coach without knowing exactly what happened, if the person doesn't want to tell you. But you can still get them to that place internally.
One of the most simple and beautiful things that Christina said to me when probably right before she offered me this book, she said the words, "Who is this for?"
uh,
Based on the smile on your face, I can't wait for the answer.
well, who is this for is the really simple ethical awareness tool in my toolkit. And I came up with it many years ago. And it's just a very simple question that identifies any conflict of interest that is there. For example, to give you a really simple one. Okay, the person is crying and screaming and crying, and I really want to offer them a Kleenex, a tissue. And so I ask, who's this for? Am I trying to help them because they want to mop their eyes? Or am I trying to fix them because I'm uncomfortable with them crying and screaming? So with any intervention, or another example is a lot of people like to tell teaching stories, from their own experience. So who's this for? Is this really the right time? Can I do this skillfully? Is this something that's going to empower the person, or am I doing it because I like to tell my story and it makes me feel like I know something and have something to give? And sometimes we don't have something to give. We're not great healers. It's already happening without us, and we're just there we're in protection mode and responsible party mode and connecting, and we are not doing the healing. The healing is happening.
The first thing that I thought of was if I ask that question to myself, who is this for? And if I catch myself and maybe or not catch myself and I do it anyway, but I realize at some point that that was for me rather than for them, that just leads me right back into my own work, and it leads me right back into supervision or a peer support group or something like that for me to
Yes,
bring up and say, like, it wasn't for me, now let's figure out why I did it.
absolutely. And you don't have to do it right then. You can say to yourself, okay, it's for me. I will tend to that later. And I will keep my agreement to do so.
Beautiful. Let's switch topics here. In the book, you write about dual and multiple role relationships. And I'm wondering if you can just maybe briefly describe a dual role relationship and a multiple role relationship, knowing that a lot of the people that listen to this podcast, like, didn't go through, we didn't have our masters in psychotherapy, and like we're approaching this from a kind of a neophyte perspective in some cases.
Mhm. Well, it's really simple. It's not, you don't have to use a lot of academic language or anything. It's when dual relationship is when there's more than one role with a client in a professional sense, dual relationship. So you're not only a professional responsible party, you're also a friend, or you also go to the same church, or um, you are a relative or whatever. And multiple relationship is when you have a lot of them. And one thing I probably should say right off the bat is that I realized years ago that there is an inherent dual relationship built into extraordinary state work, because we are in an ordinary state of consciousness when we work with people for preparation for the session. We are really the person who has more information. We're the expert, and they have all their defenses uh, at their beck and call, and they can make decisions about informed consent and so forth. But then when they go into the session, that things change. They are vulnerable, as we've talked about, and the practitioner is not the expert, in my opinion. Practitioner should be expert at being a responsible party, but not the expert at what the agenda is for healing, because the inner healer is that. And both the experiencer and the practitioner are in the service of what emerges, like a midwife, and cooperating with that. So there's power shifts that happen in dual relationship. Going into the session, there's an up power shift for the responsible party because they're responsible for more things, and a down power shift because of vulnerability and suggestibility for the experiencer. So does that
Yeah,
explain
yeah, I think
dual
so. I'm gonna
relationship well enough?
can we go one step more complicated now?
Sure.
In the book, I'm gonna read the quote first, and then I'm gonna literally ask you to help me figure out a problem if you're willing to do that. I'm gonna get some free consulting today if you're open to that.
Okay. I'll try.
So in the book, you said members of the clergy have to step nimbly, often learning by trial and error between a myriad roles they play with their clients, who are members of the church, temple, or mosque. With the same people, they may have a social relationship, a coworker relationship, an employer relationship, whether supervising actual employees or volunteers, a teaching role, a spiritual director role, and a counseling function. So that's the end of that quote. I see this more and more and more happening in psychedelic churches that are popping up. And we have founders, clergy of psychedelic churches who are serving in all of these roles. And it gets really complicated, not only the roles themselves, but now, and this is happening for me, this gets really complicated when some of those roles have dollars attached to them and some of them don't. So sometimes I'm holding space in a Bhagavad Gita study group, and I'm just like, in that case, I'm like Sunday school teacher. Another integration circle, I might be a participant. And then there's a moment when I am in a space where it turns into more of a coach role, and that coach role has dollars and cents attached to it, which now gets to be really confusing for both myself and the people that are surrounding me with these multiple relationships. How would you tell someone like me or teach me to approach these people in a healthy way to say, hey, like, this is a role that I got to charge for, or this is I'm putting on one hat in this case and another hat in another case. Does any of that make sense?
It really does. And I think what you're bringing up is one of the most multiple roles a responsible party can have. And I think it bears saying that if you're taking on that role supersedes all the other roles when necessary. You can be in a social role and all of a sudden somebody regresses and you need to be the responsible party. Or somebody has a problem with you and you need to not defend yourself, but be the responsible party because they are having an experience of anger. And it requires a lot of communication sometimes, but even communication can be, who's this for? Who's this communication for? You know, sometimes you just listen and accept, hear what's going on and say, yeah, I'll think about that. I'll really think about that, what you're saying, and not be defensive and not communicate defensiveness. So money. I think it's important when you have multiple roles in a psychedelic church to somehow put out a statement, a written statement that everybody knows that this, you know, that this is what you get for this. This is what will be charged for that. And also I think I've seen in some situations where people, there's the question of asking for donations right after an extraordinary state of consciousness experience, even during it, or when do you ask, and who does the asking? The person who has been the responsible party and trusted process person is then asking for money. That can get very messy. So it's really, that is one of the dual relationships that has a lot of possibility for harm.
Touching right around that, Jules Evans wrote an article a couple of months ago talking about psychedelic retreat centers and how they use testimonials in their marketing. As we all know, like many retreat centers are taking testimonials like the day of or the day after some really powerful ayahuasca session. We don't get to see these people 90 days later, 180 days later, when maybe the powerful experience isn't quite as powerful. Maybe they're completely destabilized and they're needing to do a whole bunch of integration work that wasn't encapsulated in that testimonial video. But I think it's very similar to the same thing of, when are you asking for money and what is the agreement? Maybe that's where I'm getting to, even in my own mind right now. Upfront agreements, whether that's boundaries of touch, whether that's boundaries of money, getting as much of that stuff done upfront probably is a good way to approach as much of this stuff as we can.
Yes. And there's also the question of how they can know what informed consent they're giving. How will they know, if they've never had a psychedelic experience, whether they will feel like really saying things as a testimonial that they won't like after 2 months have gone by? So I think one thing you can do with that is to say, at any time, I will take this down if you ask me.
Yeah.
I think that allows for some autonomy about that situation.
I just want to share with you a tiny little bit of the process that happened in my head when
Mhm.
we were talking about clergy and multiple roles, and you have used the word responsible party multiple times, which has all made sense to me. But now, when I think of the way that I show up in the spiritual community, and when someone approaches me in a situation, the first question, if I can ask myself and ascertain, am I the responsible party? Now the whole tone and tenor of that conversation can change. If I can just accept whether or not I'm the responsible party or if I'm the participant in any one of these situations, that's the first step in making a decision on how I want to respond. Then the second one for me is, yep, I'm the responsible party right now. Is this a engagement where um, I would just want to have this conversation with you and I'm okay being in this kind of mentor space Sunday school teacher? Or is this a bigger problem that we need to bring into a coaching or a spiritual direction session? And in that case, there's dollars and cents attached to that, and let the individual make up their mind. But in this moment, the responsible party really helped me out thinking about how I'm showing up in multiple roles.
Mhm. Good. And there's another term I got from my guru is, are you being a true well-wisher for
Hmm.
this person? Which means that your well-wishing is not conflicted with your own desires and needs. And, in India, people donate and give and so forth, and the guru doesn't have to ask.
Yeah.
In this Western world, money is, uh, it's the trade is involved. So it has to be clear and communicated so that we don't violate
Unfortunately,
the heart.
wow, yeah. Most respectable intent is the action that I take that doesn't violate my heart or theirs.
Yes.
Uh, and we definitely struggle, I think, in this culture with a more of a transactional relationship with money versus India and the way that they approach the teachings and the multiple phases of life. And when I'm in this phase, I'm donating a whole bunch to the ashram because I'm paying for my teachers and I'm paying for my gurus and I'm paying for the
Hmm.
students that are coming up. And then at some point in time, like I'm going to receive some of that money back because there's people coming up behind me. And it's not about asking. It's built into the culture that we're really in
Yes.
relationship with money.
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the last things that I would love to hear your thoughts on are going back into spiritual or in psychedelic communities. What are the advantages to being in community when it comes to ethics or just in general?
Yeah. Well, a lot of my work right now is uh, about peer consultation groups. I think it's really important, as I've said, that because we're blind in some ways and we have secrets that we need to share with people, and we can get feedback that we don't know yet, and we can both together experience the unknown that we both don't know yet, um, if we're in a group. And I've looked at, well, how does this really, how could this really serve the psychedelic community? What kind of structure would be needed for peer consultation groups? And what I came up with was that the need is for people to really talk about the vulnerable things that we have talked about in this interview. So they're not keeping them secret, and they can continue on their personal development path with each other. So I've come up with a structure that really focuses on compassion and protecting vulnerability and empowering the rotation of roles in the group. So there's no expert in the group, so that people really realize that they can help each other in this way with a structure, with roles and functions. So I'm writing a book about it now, and I have a video class about it that can be either licensed by training companies or individuals can take it at psychedelic.support. Even get CEs for it. So I'm hoping that it will catch on, because I think everywhere that I've done it, I've done groups of 4 people, I've done groups of 200 people, and with breakout groups using role plays and trying out the roles and the functions. And it's worked so well. Everybody says, well, I can't believe how fast we got to a trusting place in this group with this role play. And it really surprised me how a role play can get into my stuff, because I'm coming up with my own material as I'm trying to ad lib the role play. So anyway, I'm I'm really hopeful that that will help. I think we do need community. I think the clients need community. I think one thing that practitioners could do is kind of get together and take turns facilitating a group, kind of in the 12-step model, where people share experiences and don't do cross-talking, but hear that they're not the only ones who had this really out there experience. Because I think all these people, as soon as it becomes legal, at the beginning, there's nobody that they can go home in their network and talk to about it without sounding crazy. And they're not crazy. So they need that affirmation and that normalization. So I think if we had those kinds of groups that people could go to, it would really help.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this, one of the reasons why I started the idea of psychedelic masterminds is because I think that there is I have a lack of place to share my experiences in working with people. And, I've been blessed over the last 7 or 8 years to find teachers to work with where I could eventually go and talk to them. But in fairness to them and myself, like, those sessions cost money. Supervision costs money. And doing it in a group model immediately, even if you are paying for it in a group model, it's going to reduce the cost.
Right.
The other thing that made me laugh about that was that you were talking about role play. And I'm just wrapping up a 2-year somatic psychotherapy certification course. And there's never been a role play scenario where it hasn't been a lot more about real play for me.
Yeah.
So I can resonate with that.
Yeah, I remember in Gestalt training that the teacher said, it's all an act and it's all real.
Yeah. What do you think the extra, or do leaders of spiritual communities, do leaders maybe in general, psychedelic, spiritual, whatever, but do leaders have a greater risk of dealing with some of these ethical things, and how do they handle that?
Well, I think they do if they don't have this kind of a group or some kind of people that give them feedback, because um, if you're only getting devotion and discipleship, you're very likely to get inflated and realize and not realize that you're a human being with vulnerabilities too. So I think getting that kind of support is really important.
Yeah.
From peers or supervisors. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's step our way into the speed round. A few questions here at the end of our talk. Pretty easy. Whatever comes first into your mind. The first one is, why do you do this work?
Hmm. The simplest answer is I was called to do it. I didn't want to do it. I was called to do it, and I kept getting recalled to do it, even when I wanted to do something else.
Yeah.
I think it's important because it's about relationship, and I'm a Libra.
Well, we are incredibly grateful that you listened to the call.
Yeah.
What's the most important thing this work has taught you?
Trust. Trusting the inner healer, trusting the universe, trusting myself.
Yeah.
Trusting other people have their own path. Yeah.
So we have a lot of people going through psychedelic education programs right now, whether it's MAPS or any one of the numerous education programs. Somebody coming out of one of those programs and interested in doing this work, whether it is breath work, whether it is with psychedelics, what would be the best advice you would give them on their new path?
I do constant self-inquiry and practice everything. Find a way to do extraordinary states of consciousness, experiencing and sitting, and get a peer supervision group.
Right. Is there anything that we should have asked you today that we didn't?
I was thinking that I might like to read a quote from Ram Dass.
Please.
If that's
Did
okay.
you know that that GV is short for Govindas? Like, I was given the name Govindas by Ram Dass in 2018. So
Oh,
please, if you
I
want to
did
read
not.
a quote from Ram Dass, I'm all for that.
Well, to me, his quote sums up what InnerEthics is all about. And he said, and this was from Soren Gordhammer, who spent some time with him, and he wrote it in an email. And he said, Ram Dass said, my job is to be a space where nothing in me is preventing changes that are wanting to emerge in you. I can do nothing for you but work on myself. You can do nothing for me but work on yourself. So I just love that.
I'll probably say the last two sentences of that quote more than almost any other Ram Dass quote that he's got out there, because I absolutely believe that. And I can show up and be a better space holder, a better healer, a better facilitator, a guide, if I'm doing my own work. And I just got to stay out of your work. Like, I can't do your work for you.
Nope.
I am going to ask you one more question that I had written down and forgot about. And we might fold this back into an earlier part of the episode. But I'm curious, when you're talking about the inner healer, do you have an opinion on MDMA, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and the engagement and involvement of the therapist, much more engagement, versus something like psilocybin, which is probably more directed towards the inner healer? Would that even be a fair statement that you would agree with?
No, because I think the extraordinary state is different. I mean, all the medicines are a little different in their feel and tone, but the same principle applies, that the inner healer brings up what is necessary in that time and space with those conditions present. And I've done a lot of personal work myself with MDMA and never had a therapist intervening or guiding me to a certain, and the word guide, it's like somebody who knows the way, and it's more midwifery, I think, than guiding.
I prefer the word spotter, in that, like, I'm holding the rope while you're climbing the mountain, and if you slip and fall, like, I'll hold on to the rope so you don't fall. And then sometimes you might need a little help, like, hey, there's a handhold at like
Yeah.
9 o'clock if you just reach up and to the left. But at best, I'm just like hanging out on the ground, making sure that you don't hurt yourself.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I really think that MDMA will bring up what it needs to bring up. Also, it doesn't need an intervention or
Mm.
guidance. I think if people are trying to get something done with PTSD or whatever, it probably works okay, but I don't think it's necessary.
That's what I wanted to hear. That's what I needed.